Yeah, we're here with Zack Beauchamp. I've been aware of your name for like a decade. You started at Think Progress, right?
That's right. Yeah, good memory.
Yeah, but in my head, I've always said your name, Zack Beauchamp. So it
Nope,
was
teach them. It's weird. Blame the English. It's actually their fault. If you go
okay.
back
It's their
in
fault.
time. So there's my dad is from the South, but the South got this. I mean, if you read the book, you know that, right? But if you got that originally came from England. So there's at the Tower
Hmm.
of London, there's a Beauchamp Tower that's pronounced the same way.
I
Uh,
always blame the English, whatever happens. I think it's such a safe bet because there's some chance that at some point in history they did do something that interfered with that thing.
No, the hit rate's very
yeah.
high on that one. It's just like as a heuristic, just throw a dart, and usually you'll end up blaming the English correctly.
All right. So you've written an insightful book, came out last year, The Reactionary Spirit: How America's Most Insidious Political Tradition Swept the World. But before we jump in, what is your journalistic background? How did you come to be someone who'd write a book about right-wing ideology?
Sure. So got it. I started in journalism totally as a whim. Not a whim is a little bit of exaggeration, but like I thought I was going to be a professor. And so the night I was going to be a law professor, and the night I was going to take the LSAT, I was like, wait, I don't want to do this. But I
Mm.
don't know what else I want to do. And so I bailed on the test and then started looking around for a job. And I had been reading blogs for a while and applied for a job at a blog that I admired, Andrew Sullivan's blog, the Daily Dish back in the day, and ended
Mm.
up getting it. And from there, I realized that like a sort of blend between some kind of what blogs allowed that I liked was an ability to explore ideas in a way that was outside the sort of constricting confines of academia, the publishing requirements of a very particular sort, the lack of an audience, the ability to not sort of to consider ideas in a very narrow, circumscribed way. Nothing against it. I read tons. I mean, the book, is very informed by academic ideas and research, but I just wanted to try doing things a little bit differently, intellectual inquiry a little bit differently.
Mm.
And so I ended up staying with that world, and I found that like, the internet and in the stage that it was at that point in time was like a very friendly place to that kind of ideological exploration. I feel like professionally I sort of like got there right before somebody pulled the ladder up, and now it's increasingly difficult to like make it as a text-based journalist who cares about ideas, although Substack may be changing that. Um, but so that's sort of what led me there. And my interest had always been, I mean, I said earlier I wanted to be a law professor, not just like to talk about the law, but because I was sort of interested in big picture questions about liberalism and democracy, especially as it relates to international politics. And so I always sort of had this set of interests. What changed was not so much me as the world, right? So, I mean, we all know what happened in 2015, 2016.
Mhm.
And it raised a very urgent question. And I always, for a long time, had been interested. I don't hide that I'm a political liberal, right? In fact, it's very important in the narrative of the book. Um, but yeah, I've always been interested in right-wing ideas and thinking. Or when I was at Think Progress, I wrote a column that was about like three interesting things conservatives wrote this week to try to get my like very left-leaning audience to try to take conservatism seriously as a set of ideas. But it had struck me that there had been some malignancy that set in conservatism, and this had always been a theme in my writing, but like it became undeniable around the Trump and Brexit moment, and like basically everybody else, I wanted to understand what was happening and to understand the nature of the concepts that we were dealing with, and the book is a product of the marriage between my longtime interest in these sorts of things and a deep concern for the future and the health of liberal democracy, married with a moment of acute crisis, and a crisis emanating from a particular point on the spectrum, right? It's not that it's like an omni crisis and it's coming from all sorts of different places. Like, interwar Europe, there was legitimate dangers coming from both the left and the right in equal measure, right? Like what was the Soviet Union other than the Cold War would later prove a massive totalitarian anti-democratic threat. You ended up having to decide between those two things, and I think the sort of broader democratic world made the right choice there. But here in our era, in advanced democracies, there's just like this real puzzle that overwhelming, like we're in an era where democracy seemed to be under ideological threat. It was not like the interwar period. It was not like the Cold War period where there were threats from both ideological sides. It's that overwhelmingly it had been right-wing movements that had been the source of the threat. And so why, right? That's historically quite unusual. And so a lot of those different places came together to produce an inquiry into what it is about our moment that made it very particularly vulnerable to a sort of right-wing anti-democratic politics.
I actually
Yeah, and
have,
you're also someone. Oh,
sorry.
go ahead now.
I have a quote that I found very interesting in the book, in the Orbán chapter. Let me just pull it up.
Sure.
Which I think kind of captures the contradiction that we're talking about here. You say, page 114. You say Orbán has built a perfect authoritarian state for harnessing the reactionary spirit, a legalistic, and now starts my quote, almost invisibly authoritarian regime seen by its supporters as the last true bulwark of European democracy. So we are looking at, and by we, I mean the public who is somehow attracted to the ethos of this, talk about malignancy and how attractive that might be, looking at the conservatives now at the time of illiberalism and seeing it as more democratic than its opposite would be. How is that possible? I mean, this is such a huge contradiction, right? Even within your sentence, it's kind of jumps out.
Yeah, something I've thought about a lot, and I feel like even after I published the book, is still sort of widely under discussed, but is like, I think really essential to understanding the formal nature of democratic backsliding in our era. So like the part of my answer to Brian's question was about the ideological character of democratic backsliding, and that I mean, that sort of was the impetus to the book. But as I looked more and more into the topic, after years of writing about this, I realized there was something that really was important in the formal structure of how it works, which is that the way that democracies die, or at least once they've reached a certain point of political advancement, right, or democratic strength, is not by somebody saying democracy is over now, right? That's just not the pattern, right? You can look at a variety of different countries, Venezuela, Hungary, Turkey. These are not all right-wing backslider examples, but they're just examples of modern democratic backsliding, right? Poland is another good example. The Philippines recently, Brazil, the United States, obviously, Israel, the other example in the book. Not a single one of these leaders says we're done with democracy. Democracy is over, right? That's just not at all what their rhetoric is. They all claim, even though they're all ideologically diverse, right? Though again, an overwhelmingly right-wing group to fit with the thesis of the first half of my answer. But nonetheless, there's Venezuela, left-wing anti-democratic regime, and then Turkey, which is kind of hard to classify, sort of Islamist, sort of not. And that they all say that they keep holding elections. Oftentimes they're not actually formally rigged in the sense that the ballot box is stuffed the way that it is in a country like Iran or Russia or Saudi Arabia doesn't even have elections, right? So it's not really the point. Right? Those elections are generally, they're free in that sense. Like it's not the counts aren't rigged. And that's important to the regime that they don't do that. Right now, well, it'll be interesting to see in Hungary whether Orbán feels like he needs to in the next election. That's sort of a separate thing we can talk about maybe later. But they care about this. It matters to them to present themselves as democratic. And the thing is, I think some of them actually believe that they are. Right? It's like there's this constant push and pull between these governments that are destroying democracy. Are they doing so self-consciously because they know that they just want to seize power? I think that's true in certain cases. I think J.D. Vance here has all but openly said he's fine with that. Right? He's someone it's very clear what he's doing. Trump, I think, is sort of a unique case. But when you look at the people in Poland, in PIS, oftentimes the way that they talk about or think about what they were doing while they were in power really seems to reflect a genuine sense that they felt like the post-communist system was rigged against them and they're trying to unrig it. Again, I can't speak to I've never spoken to one of the Kaczynskis, so I can't say if they're being genuine here, but I think there's at least a plausible thesis here that they believe this. And it's in part because we live in a world that is still defined ideologically, even as geopolitically it's not, by the post-Cold War unipolar moment. No one has developed an ideological narrative of political legitimacy that is capable of running against the democratic one, which is that power flows from the consent of the people. That is basically a universally accepted premise of politics everywhere but a handful of authoritarian states. One of those is very influential, China, but China is not very good at exporting its political model. They spend a lot of money on externally facing propaganda, and maybe it's improved China's political image, but it's done nothing to create like a Chinese style political movements in countries that have settled democracies.
I mean, China too feels that, I mean, people in power in China do feel that their power is legitimate. It's just that the process through which they think they acquired it is different, right? But I mean,
Yeah, I
that's
mean, no,
more
it's
of
a
an
different theory of
economics,
legitimacy, right? Like, and that's what I'm talking about here, the theory of what makes the exercise of power legitimate, and not just in their own heads, but also like what they tell their citizens. In China, it's, we're delivering a higher quality of life for you. We're delivering stability. Our form of government is superior in its outputs. Like, that's a theory of legitimacy. Democracy's theory of legitimacy is different. It's not just that we provide outputs. It's that you have a moral right to choose who governs you. And like governments that do not give, there's my son, governments who give different people power are, that don't give people power over who they choose are necessarily, there's something wrong with them, the existence of them. And that narrative is still very dominant, right? That a government that exercises arbitrary, non-consensual power is illegitimate in most places in the world, which is why so many countries that might otherwise be just authoritarian still feel the need to hold elections like this, and why they still claim, even if they don't sincerely believe it, which again, it's on the fence in different cases, they claim to be the truest vindicators of democracy. It's essential to winning political power that you claim at least to believe in democratic principles. Otherwise, you'll put yourself at a severe disadvantage politically. Nobody wants to vote for the party that says, and yes, we're going to abolish elections, and no, we don't care about the idea that you should get to choose who's in charge of you. We're going to impose a 1,000-year Reich. That kind of thing does not work anymore given sort of modern moral sensibilities. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that those modern moral sensibilities are in many ways what's at the heart of the rise of the anti-democratic right. So they're playing a very delicate game where they operate inside the moral parameters of democracy while seeking to undermine them.
and why it's so dangerous to promise the riches to people, right? Which seems to be at the core of the new social contract in, for instance, China. I mean, you say that they are starting to resemble Russia, if I remember correctly. Like at some point, people will start having less money, or at least less money than they expected. And then the social contract will, be under question.
Yeah, I mean, this is
For Trump as well, by the way, right? I mean, like he promises things
sure.
to happen after the, I don't know, imposing tariffs, and then when that doesn't come to happen, you have to say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, the good thing about democracy is that it allows for power alternation, right? And so stability comes not from the success of any individual politician, right, in material terms, because then people can always choose, right? Like, I don't like this guy. I'll vote for another one. And the system itself is meaningfully stable because one policy failure did not redound against the system itself. It redounded to the failure or was blamed on the failure of that particular government. Authoritarian governments don't have that release valve in terms of stability, right? If there's a failure, policy failure, well, it's not like voters can say, I'm angry, I'd like to change governments now. It's they have to change systems. They're not allowed to. And so discontent with policies much more becomes discontent with a system, or it's much more easy for that to happen in an authoritarian state. And I think that's one of the dangers that China is running. The China chapter of the book is very much informed by the work of because I'm not a China expert, right? These other countries I know better. I know their politics better. I've studied them more directly. I can't claim to be a China expert, but I rely pretty heavily on the work of people who are. And there are scholars like Michael Beckley, who I think is really good, has a great piece out in Foreign Affairs right now, about sort of envisioning a future where there's no such thing as great powers. But that sort of the very idea of a great power as we understand it was a product of the unique conditions of the Industrial Revolution that no longer hold, right? They're no longer feasible. The level of sustained and rapid growth that can power hegemonic challengers no longer happening. And Beckley is a China scholar, and he and others like him, Stephen Brooks and William Wolfforth, are two other good examples of this. Of people who work on this stuff argue that China is vastly overrated economically as compared to the United States. And it has severe structural disadvantages that will hamper its ability to become an attractive political model in the future. So like now, right now, there's a particular vogue for being like the future is China is because the United States is screwing up royally at every possible moment geopolitically. But the United States basically self-immolating politically does not necessarily mean that China is going to rise. It just means that the United States is squandering, I think, historical opportunity to preserve its own, not just like hegemonic in the sense of dominant position, but its ideologically hegemonic position in the sense of creating a political world order that is suited to American style systems.
That seems to be in contradiction with this impression that I seem to be seeing among a lot of people that China is so attractive for at least this reason, that it seems to be able to build so much at will. You know, there aren't like regulations against building infrastructure or kind of green lighting new technology initiatives that, if you know, see like highlights of these things on video, like going through social media, they seem really impressive. Meanwhile, like we can't seem to build anything because it takes forever to green light some project, and then it takes forever to actually get it done. But how does that interact with that assessment that economically China doesn't seem viable?
Well, so it is true that advanced democracies have a problem with overregulation and cost overruns, difficulty in building, right? Like all the stuff in abundance is true. I like Desra and Derek a lot. They're friends. Great, good. Concede all that. This is the problems in China are different. Like, yeah, they can really do things. There aren't regulations that get in the way of the Chinese state if it wants things to happen. But that's the problem, right? Is their growth model is dependent on building things of dubious viability. This is it's the problem that China experts call rebalancing, right? So China, its economy is balanced towards investment, which is government spending on projects or spending on like construction projects. So in China, there are entire ghost cities, like places that have been built in order to employ people, basically, but nobody actually lives there. And so the idea is you start economic growth that way. The problem is that's like after a certain point, that's throwing away money. You invest, you build all these buildings, but if they're not doing anything, that's not contributing to growth in the long run, and you end up stagnating. The jobs, the growth, the gains from employing people to build those buildings is basically illusory. It's useless. In order to sustain, to get out of what's called the middle income trap, which is that countries get stuck in a particular level of development and have trouble increasing their per capita GDP. The general consensus among economists is that you need to change your pattern towards domestic consumption. So instead of China building stuff in low-cost factories and building domestic infrastructure, they need to make it such that their own consumers are buying consumer goods at higher rates, right? And that means, well, it means a lot of different things, but it means less spending on infrastructure, more spending on things like a social safety net, right? Which then gives people discrete income, makes them not have to worry about something like healthcare or housing, which they can then spend back on consumer goods. That's how you get higher GDP growth.
Only the Soviets had already realized this during the perestroika, no? I mean, this whole,
Yeah.
sorry, but like, wasn't there like a giant 50-year experiment that completely failed about this? Like, centrally deciding how much bread should be baked, and then like entire countries going hungry and millions of people dying. Like, we've already been through this.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese version of it's better, right? In the sense that it's a kind of state capitalism where there's a lot of, it's not like a centrally planned economy. There's a lot of running room left to individual executives within the political confines set by the CCP. So it's not, it's not a full Soviet command and control type system, which has all the flaws that you were describing, but it still has the same central flaw, which is that you're still trying to get the government to allocate resources in a particular way, and it makes you subject economically to the vicissitudes of like people who are involved in government. So there's a whole class of people in China who get super rich off of all these construction projects. And those people really don't want the government to do what it needs to do in order to economically rebalance. So it creates a really difficult, including people who are around the president. So as much as Xi can sort of like do what he wants, he also, like all authoritarians, has to please the people who keep him in power, right? Who listen to him. And that makes it just very difficult very difficult to do the like smart technocratic reforms that you need to do. And there's like a checklist that China put out like a decade or two ago about what it needed to do to rebalance. Good checklist, widely agreed upon. They did like 10% of it or something like that. Like it's not working out. And then there's sort of, I talk about this a lot in the book, but there's huge demographic problems, right? Which is that they have this very typical of East Asian countries now, rapidly graying population. And if you want to rebalance, right, well, and increasing your safety net, well, part of that means elder care. Well, if you have to pay for a massive gray population, thanks not just to sort of general demographic trends, but also the one-child policy, well, shit, you have to pay for all those old people. And where's that money going to come from? Well, like, you don't have enough young people to tax them to be able to afford for a really good elder care system. And that's just a huge problem because they also don't have large numbers of immigration, right? Their system is built not to allow for a lot of that. And a lot of people don't want to live under the Chinese political system. So it's a real mess. I find a lot of the predictions of rapid Chinese ascent, global hegemony, and we haven't even gotten into the military piece of it, but they're to be wildly unpersuasive. So it's not that I think that China's unimportant. It's hugely important. It's the second most powerful country in the world. I just think in like raw geopolitical power terms, it's not going to eclipse the United States, maybe ever. And that means what happens in American politics is in some ways even more important than it seems, because structurally, the US is still set up to be the dominant political power in the world.
Interesting. Could I go back to some background personal questions? I'm interested to hear you to comment on.
Yeah, sure.
So I mean, you're someone who has like roots in history, and I've always been curious about that because like my family, as far as I know, I don't have any kind of historical roots enmeshed in or connected to any kind of significant event or anything like that. So how's that influenced your sense of self and what you feel like maybe your calling in any sense?
Yeah, if you haven't read the book, there's a sort of tension between me as a character and between like two sides of my heritage. Right, my mom's family are first generation. Her parents are first generation Americans, Holocaust survivors, both of them, who met afterwards in Europe when they were displaced, and then came to the U.S. And my mom, and our family has been very, reasonably religious Jew. I'm reasonably religious Jew, and that's been like very important in shaping a sort of sense of being an ethno-cultural minority in the United States and why the virtues of liberal democracy for somebody in that position, which like are feeling increasingly real in a world where, the Republican Party is letting Nick Fuentes in to be one of its primary spokespeople. And that was even worse than situation in that front's got even worse than it was when I wrote the book. But on my dad's side, it's like this super, I alluded to this at the beginning, like super old stock American. We recently found out due to like someone we know who's into family genealogy as a hobby that like someone in his family tree financed the Mayflower. Like they're like really, really old school Americans, and deep roots in the South. And one of these family historians traced us back to the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, who is, I don't know the exact number of greats. I always find that difficult to do mathematically, figuring out the precise generational gaps, but he'd be my great uncle, many greats back. And to the way that this comparison, like sort of this dual heritage made me think is it gave me a sense both of the importance, the central value of democracy, as I was alluding to it, and liberal democracy specifically, but also the precarity of it. Like my dad made a choice when he was a kid to break with what his family had been like. They weren't like they were very much of that heritage. Perhaps not as ideologically committed as Davis, and they had changed. My grandparents on his side had changed by the time I knew them. But in his day, his dad was a Dallas City Councilor when it was segregated. And Dallas City Council actually, they didn't, if you read the sort of historical scholarship of this, did an unusually good job at defanging the local civil rights movement, basically by not being crazy. They didn't attack them. They let them have little protests. and ended up not overreacting and thus faced little pressure from the national press in order to do anything about it. But my dad was part of that pressure campaign. He would sneak out. Well, his dad was on these meetings trying to figure out what to do about the civil rights movement. My dad would say he was going to church on Sundays, and then he would actually go participate in sit-ins. And that's a choice that he made, right? It's not something that was inevitable or naturally part of his heritage. He read a book about apartheid in South Africa, and it made him realize it was wrong, that what was happening not only happened there, but that what he was living under was basically the same. And he couldn't believe that everyone was just accepted this. The way he described it to me, living in the segregated South, it wasn't something that people talked about. It was just a fact of life, like the weather. Everyone just thought that's how it was. And you didn't even treat it like a political issue, right? It was. And he thought this was crazy, but it took active work and imagination on his part. That there were lots of people around him who were good and decent and kind people in many facets of their life who accepted a fundamentally evil state of affairs. And that meant to me, or made me think, that this is like, this democracy that's been so good for my mom's side of the family, that created the conditions for us to live as a successful people here and be happy and feel secure in the US, was also one that required vigilance, required people taking acts of not only just moral courage, but also of thinking about the ways and the seams and the breakages and potential breakpoints or fail points in the system. And that's why, when this stuff started, the sort of rising radical right-wing populism started to become an issue, to me, it just became the issue. The only issue is what is this and why is this happening? And what does it mean for these societies, which are, not just in the US, but globally? Historically, liberal democracy is very new, right? It's not, we've only lived in a world where the majority of countries have been democracies. We might not currently, but we did for a period of time after the fall of the Soviet Union. And that was it, right? That was it. Large numbers of democracies. After World War II, there were something like 12 democracies anywhere in the globe. So the world that we live in, where democratic concepts and ideas are so dominant, democratic political systems so common, is very, very new and much more fragile, I think, than it's widely seen as, though maybe now everyone's finally realizing that that's the case.
And you wrote that having that background turned you into America's littlest patriot. I'm curious if you still consider yourself an American patriot, or if you've kind of evolved into something perhaps more nuanced or complex, or
He
what
lives
have you.
in Canada, guys. I mean, come on.
And for that reason, now more than ever, right?
Yeah. It's so much easier to love something from afar.
He's an exile.
It's not very far. It's like an hour and a half drive. It's really quite close.
Are you in Toronto?
No, I live in the city called London, Ontario, which is where my wife's university is, and is about like 2 hours from Detroit, an hour and a half from the border.
Do you say this in your book? No.
No, I hadn't moved yet.
I thought it was like hush hush.
No.
I thought we were like the exclusive place where Zack reveals
that I live in Canada. No,
the true location.
I'm just not going around pretending I did it because I was scared of Trump rounding me up and putting me in a camp.
But you could get like at least 3 Blue Sky posts about yourself if you pretended it was like a Timothy Snyder thing.
No, first of all, that wasn't why Tim did it. If you read an interview, he did it because
like a selfie with Jason Stanley,
Yeah. Also, Jason maybe, but Tim left because he and Marcy had spent a semester at the University of Toronto and they really liked it and they wanted to leave Yale anyway. And he kind of didn't actually. Again, this is all an article. I'm not saying anything that he's told me in private. But Marcy did. She was worried about Trump too, and so they had planned to move, but they mostly liked it at Toronto. They had planned to move before the election result, so it happened afterwards. And it was great branding on their part to jump on it, but it's not it doesn't actually fit the timeline of what happened. Yeah. Little inside anti-authoritarian gossip for you guys.
There you go.
Can I have a theoretical question before we will also open the room for questions? And guys, you're welcome to ask in the chat, and then we will read up, or you can also just raise your hand, and then we will go to you. I recently hosted a salon with Peter Thiel, before which I had to read Carl Schmitt, among other thinkers that I never before had the chance or the inclination to read, which is
That's
actually quite.
a good get for you, Anna. That was a good
Oh
one.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I work hard, and it was super interesting. And I'm a philosopher of arts and ethics, so I wasn't doing any political philosophy during postgrad. And it was really interesting to kind of like dive into these texts because it makes me understand things a little bit better, because otherwise you would be like, where is this coming from? And then you realize like, oh, there are actually like hundreds of years of traditions here. We did the same on Internet. Like I did a reading group of Tocqueville, and that was my first time reading Tocqueville, and we read the whole book in like 6 months and had very vigorous discussions about it. And you realize like a lot of things that seem very original in campaigns, in rock songs, in Twitter bios are actually
Yeah.
derived from these foundational texts. And it seems like in some circles, Carl Schmitt is the foundational text. And when we talk about decisionism, when we talk about why Trump says that he's not just above the law, but he is the law, when we treat everybody as either a friend or an enemy, and it's extremely binary, it actually comes from a place, and there are many Washington, D.C. conservative reading groups discussing this weekly. So do you want to maybe for the Carl Schmitt Virgin to give a little bit of an intro what this is and how it relates to the reactionary spirit and your thesis?
Yeah, I do. It might be a little bit long, but I will do my best to keep it short, because Schmitt is
ask this like so with so much time left, because you never know.
Schmitt is
Yeah.
a fascinating figure. He is brilliant, but also a total monster, historically. So, like, he's a jerk, not just a jerk, a deeply committed anti-Semite. He
It's
jumped
like
on board.
evil, right? Like it's
He's a
evil.
really bad man, but
Yeah.
also
By the way, he likes Tocqueville. That was the most surprising line in the book to me. That he's like, oh, if people are God, then fine, just have some God. And I was like, okay.
So, I mean, look, Schmitt likes the sort of aristocratic tradition that Tocqueville comes from. And while Tocqueville had a much more admiration for democracy than Schmitt did, well, Schmitt claims he likes democracy. It's all, he really is, I think, the sort of central theorist of what's going on in global politics right now. Though it's not the explicit line that people often draw, where it's like, oh yes, you see these people like Steve Bannon, they read Schmitt and therefore they developed this line of politics. No, not the case. First of all, Steve Bannon's not that smart. Second, I'm sure he did read Schmitt, but he's not that smart. Second,
wait, I thought if I read these thinkers, I become smart. It's not, there's no causal relation.
It's not really how it's not.
Okay,
Really.
I'm going to cancel my Amazon orders. No.
Don't read Alexander Dugin. It's a huge waste of time. But Schmitt isn't, right? Schmitt is what he is a diagnostician. He understood before anyone else really did how you do extreme right politics in a democracy in a context that's hostile to it. I think he actually, in some ways, in his early writing, he overestimated how hostile Germany was to far-right politics. He himself was early on a critic of the Nazis. He wanted the Weimar government to declare state of emergency and crack down on all extremist parties, including the Nazis, because he believed in central authority first and foremost. He was
because
not.
the Nazis were the plebs for him, right? Like we forget that they were, like you describe a lot of counter-elite movements in the book, and they were one of the ultimate counter-elite examples in history.
Right, they were gross and uncouth.
The rabble rousers.
Yeah. And that's not.
I mean, the disenchanted sons of the dead fathers of World War II, basically, right? The fatherless generation.
Yeah, certainly not. And he was among the sort of literary conservative intellectuals that the conservative revolution is the term that they describe themselves as.
Yeah.
But Schmitt was a member of that, though he was a lawyer rather than a writer. Anyway, so basic Schmitt view of the world is like a really, really difficult searching critique of the practice of democracy. It's often described as anti-democratic, but it's really more precisely anti-liberal. It is ultimately anti-democratic, but Schmitt himself saw his task as prizing the sort of true conflict between democracy and liberalism. And so by which he means that liberalism had a vision of politics that was universal. right? That it meant that all people were deserving of a certain set of rights. They are owed these rights on the basis that they are human. And the task of politics is to deliver a world in which those rights are vindicated, right? Basically, quibble with that if you want as a liberal theorist, but that's Schmidt's basic account of it. Democracy for Schmidt is a political system, right? It's a way of determining who should hold power on the basis of, acclamation and support from the people. But wait, who's the people, right? Who are the people? Who gets to make that judgment, and who counts as the people? And one of his most forceful arguments in Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy, or CPD, in one of his most famous works, written in 1923, Schmidt argues that this creates an insufferable tension between liberalism and democracy. Liberalism is constantly trying to expand the sphere of people who should be included in a polity, but it can't include everybody. You can't do that, right? You always have to say that there are citizens and non-citizens, people who get a vote and who don't get a vote. And ultimately, that means liberalism is a lie. It's incompatible with a democratic political system, one that always gives rise, it promises something impossible, essentially a world state that can never happen. And in doing so, it lies to people about what politics is about and what it's for. What politics is actually about is what it's for, and he talks about this more at length in his book. This is his most famous book, The Concept of the Political. And here he creates this famous friend-enemy distinction, right? That the purpose of politics, this is how you do this who's in and who's out stuff, right? Is that it's about a particular group, which is homogenous in a certain sense, defining itself against other groups, right? Against other groups who could be understood to be enemies. And an enemy in this sense is not just like someone you don't like, it's someone who can meaningfully be warred upon. That is, that you could conceive of as exterminating them. Whereas people who are in the friend group, right, are not that, right? People in the friend group for Schmidt are people who you share a polity with, who share a certain set of commitments to that render them outside the scope of being exterminated. Like, it's very obvious to see.
It should be like a deja vu, right? I'm sure everybody here in the room right now has like ICE recruitment tweets flashing up before your eyes. Like this is the playbook. Like you can actually do this.
Yeah, you hear it, right? But the crucial thing for Schmidt that's like really important is, I think there's two things that are of relevance here. One is that it does not matter what these distinctions are. Right? This is why Schmidt wasn't a Nazi. Like, though he hated Jews, religion wasn't the only antagonism that mattered to him. Like, you use any other distinction you want. Could be nationality, could be race, could be religion, ethnicity, whatever, could be, I don't know, eye color. He doesn't care. What matters is that you take that a political system define itself as being for one group and against those of another group. And if you can establish that distinction and you can make it and use it as the defining marker of a polity, right, of a group, then you can create a political system that's stable, meaningful, and coherent around that distinction. It does not matter what it is. Yeah. He doesn't care. Right? He at least explicitly eschews normative judgment and just says the task of politics is primarily about carving out that distinction and then acting on it ruthlessly.
And this is where you realize that basically all illiberal systems are fascist, because this is just described like Stalinism or the Khmer Rouge.
Yeah, a lot of them they do all share this particular Schmittian feature, right? Of that's like sort of basically and fundamentally hostile to liberalism. And the second point is this thing about democracy. Like Schmidt says, like this obviously seems undemocratic to us, right? Because from Schmidt's point of view, and even citizens of a country, nominally, legally, can be seen as enemies or should be included in the enemy group. Because who cares, right? Who cares if, to go back to the Nazi example, who cares if the Jew is living in Austria or living in Germany? They're still the Jew. They're still opposed to the German nation. And so they still ought to be excluded. And so Schmidt argues that democracy can justifiably exclude those people. They don't count. They're not real people. What is real? What matters is being part of the included group. And that, so you don't even need to actually have that, according to Schmidt, to have a democracy. You don't have to have those people vote. You just need to have like a sense among the people in the homogenous group, right? In the friend group, that they like all like this particular guy, right? And that this guy or this group should be in charge. And that to him is democracy. He has this whole thing about who cares about this ballot counting, bean counting liberal nonsense? What matters is a sense of acclamation among the people that their representative speaks for the homogenous group. That is very similar, even though Schmidt thought the Nazis were gauche, so not so much at the time that the concept of the political came out just a little bit later. But though Schmidt thought the Nazis were gauche, that was very similar to the argument that some fascist theorists made about why the elevation of Mussolini and Hitler was actually an expression of true democracy. That it was a sort of authentic representation of the organic people, even if they didn't have elections. Look at those crowds. Look at how excited those people, right? Look at how much they love it. Those are the real people. And because those people like it, it is democratic. And this is, of course, really central to modern democratic backsliding, this particular vision. Not only the stuff about friend and enemy, which is very obvious, but the idea that there's a real and legitimate people versus an illegitimate one, right, is really at the heart of right-wing populism wherever it happens. Left-wing populism is different, right, in some respects, right? But I don't even like the term populism because it often conflates a bunch of different things together. But in a very specifically radical right-wing variant, this populism is about saying that there is a real and good people who are being betrayed by traitors to the nation in our midst, who are aligned with a corrupted elite. Right. And this is just extremely Schmittian. And also what's Schmittian is the part about saying, and therefore we can seize power for ourselves and use it against that group, that is democratic, because that represents the authentic consensus of the true people. Right. It's a centrally Schmittian move and really important. So it's like he wrote this stuff in the 20s and 30s, but 100 years later, it's a blueprint. It's like it reads like a playbook for how to do radical right-wing politics nearly anywhere.
So how do successes of the far right party you mentioned in France, the FN, illustrate your point that in Europe, extreme right-wing groups are becoming or have become Americanized? Like, what is particularly American about far right politics in Europe now?
Yeah. So the argument I make is that part of Schmidt, the argument that authoritarianism should be described or best described as a form of democracy, or there can be it needs to be masked or cloaked in democratic language. I argue that preceded Schmidt in one particular place, at least the United States, and that this is really the country that pioneered a veiled form of authoritarianism. And it needed to do so precisely because of the same conditions that pertain globally, pertain here, or in the US broadly, today, or which is that democracy was ideologically dominant and had been since the American founding. And in the 18th century, there was no other country where that was the case, where the political culture was so thoroughly controlled by democratic ideas that simply saying, I want to be a king, was not going to work. It's fun because like you can go back and look at the election between Adams and Jefferson, the first competitive election in American history. And one of the big like smear lines that the pro-Jefferson campaign deployed against Adams is that he wanted to be a king, right? Because he favored a stronger executive than Jefferson did was. So that's like how pro-democratic American culture was in ideological terms, even as there were massive restrictions on who could vote. And for that reason, the authoritarian strain in American politics, which I argue grew out of the American South, right, and specifically out of the experience of slavery, which was often self-consciously understood as an authoritarian institution, right, an outgrowth, a version of European feudalism, a caste hierarchy where the rightful aristocrats ruled by force over the lower classes, right, that vision of politics couldn't call itself feudalism or authoritarianism in the same way. It needed to develop a democratic language to justify that. And so much of the history, especially I'd argue in the postbellum period and the Reconstruction, where the South needed to coexist in an environment where it couldn't just say we're bringing back slavery, right, really was the moment when the earliest version of authoritarian system that masked itself as democratic came to emerge. And this, I don't think that like everybody self-consciously copied the Americans here. I think it's more like, excuse me for just a second.
Some water.
Yeah, got some. more like what biologists call convergent evolution, where faced with similar pressures, two animals in very different places alight on similar traits. This is what happens. This is how authoritarianism works in an environment where democracy is ideologically dominant. It figures out a way to mask itself, often by calling itself a kind of representative of the people. And Schmidt theorized that, right? Schmidt realized that before most other people did and framed it in a more generalized way.
So maybe this is a good place to like really distinguish what reactionary politics, what the reactionary spirit is versus kind of run-of-the-mill right-wing politics or conservative politics. How would you tease those apart?
Yeah, so I have sort of a bright line for how to distinguish them, which is, do you operate within the confines of the democratic system, right? So first, there's right-wing authoritarianism, which is a broad category. There's right-wing politics, which is an even broader category. There's right-wing populism, which is another category. And what I call the reactionary spirit sets at the Venn diagram of all of those different things, right? It's a very unique and kind of special case. So there are lots of kinds of right-wing authoritarianism, right? Like, and many of them are not reactionary in the sense that they are reacting to something that is going on in the society, right? They're not a response to something that's happening. I call it the reactionary spirit because I argue sort of my general core thesis about the origins of this is that it is a response to the rise, not just of democracy, but the ideological underpinnings of democracy, the moral underpinnings of democracy, the notion of universal human equality, a very liberal idea, that spread around the globe after World War II. And that combined with democracy's ideological hegemony produced a backlash that had to hide itself. But the second and the sort of flip side of this is that not all right-wing parties or even radical right-wing parties are reactionary in the sense that they're not necessarily opposed to democracy or core democratic principles, right? They may have views on policy issues that me, as somebody who's broadly left-wing, find abhorrent, but that doesn't mean that they're opposed to democracy per se, or not somebody who could, be imagined as successfully winning power and then alternating peacefully when they lose, right? So not all radical right-wing factions are taken or are created equal. It's very obvious that there are conservative parties, sort of general conservative parties that are compatible with democracy. In fact, it's essential to democracy to have conservative parties. Daniel Ziblatt wrote a wonderful book about this, about how conservative parties helped acclimate members, more sort of elite members of European democracies when they were first emerging, helped made them comfortable with the idea of democracy, that they could still defend their own interests without aristocracy or a king to enforce it by force. And so in that way, conservative parties are really important. But even radical right-wing parties, right? Like a lot of the ones on the European continent right now can be compatible with democracy in this minimalist sense, that they're not seeking to overthrow the system. They wouldn't try to undermine the conditions that allow their opposition to compete fairly if they're given power. And it's hard to know which is which. There are like a few pretty clear cases, right? Like some of them have served in government and have not done anything while in government to be especially scary. Now, that's not always a good metric. I mean, Orbán's first term in government was not actually that threatening to democracy, and then look what happened afterwards. But that's not at the same time, it's a heuristic, right? It's one useful heuristic. And then there are other ones that are just like blatant about how far they're not quite saying we're authoritarians, look at us, but they're pretty naked in terms of their desire to radically revolutionize the political system in ways that would be very dangerous. And here, I think the clearest example is AfD in Germany, right? Which has let in monarchist and neo-Nazi factions into its party. The things that their legislators say on a routine basis are really quite disturbing. Their attacks on Holocaust memory culture in Germany are like very obvious neo-Nazi dog whistles. Some of them, one member of the party, she was a former legislator actually, in the Bundestag, participated in a coup attempt against the German government and was arrested for that, which is indicative of a particular far-right movement called the Reichsbürger. There are people who believe that every German government since the fall of the Kaiser is illegitimate, and we need to restore the pre-World War I aristocratic government. the Reichsbürger have infiltrated the ranks of AfD professionally to like a pretty striking degree. The party is now under surveillance by the German government for these reasons. And that's not just like garden variety. If you listen to JD Vance talk about this, it's like, oh, it's speech repression and they hate the political right. No, there's very, very good reasons why the German government is concerned about this particular party. But the fact that someone like Vance says something like this that's the reactionary spirit at work, right? It's the way in which you can say, oh, it's political persecution, when in fact what it is a kind of democratic self-defense against someone who would destroy it. But the fact that they still nominally claim to operate within the democratic system gives them a certain amount of plausible deniability, allowing them to attract international allies who are ideologically simpatico, like Vance.
There's also this weird psychological, another form of being a reactionary in the actual original sense of reacting to things.
Yeah.
Because if you look at Putin's problems in 1999, 2000, Orbán losing in 2002, right? He doesn't get reelected, so he takes power in 1998, and actually, I voted for the first time in my life in 2002, so I remember that election. The political persecution of like Germany's far right, and they're all like, I feel like this new type of information system developed internationally between these people, where they are able now to learn from each, like a malicious AI. They are able to learn from each other's failures now, because when Orbán loses power in 2002, that was a huge trauma, right? So his first government didn't look that scary, and he failed. So the next time he comes back in a very Star Wars way, he like knows what leads to failure, which in his case is like not being a hard enough liner. Putin, when he tries to be like relatively reasonable, suddenly has to deal with Chechnya and whatever, right? So it's like traumatized children who then become psychopaths in some sense, right? Like they experience being weak, being on the losing side, and just to say they are overreacting is a little bit of an understatement. And that used to be the course of this. Within the Egyptian system, like you have systems where the learning is generational, right? Like every Egyptian dictator inherited an already more stable baseline and could just like continue that in their own way. They didn't have to build a dictatorship from scratch. And what I find exceptionally worrying, but also intellectually interesting in the current system, is that there are so many of these examples now that you can just like learn. Like there's somebody right now learning from Putin how not to do it from his failures. Like they look at Ukraine and they are like, well, how lossy is this? And someone can like do it better. I don't know if this is the internet, it's like the law of large numbers, that you now have enough illiberalisms that are relatively legitimate looking that you can just learn from them. But that is kind of scary, right?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is just like, this is always the way that ideologically simpatico states have worked, right? I mean, this is what fascists did. It's what communists did. It's what liberal democracies did early on, right? They were studying each other. They learned from each other. It's just, that's what
yeah, like America has blue jeans. Let's kill the dictator, right? Like that was Romania.
Yeah, or even just like how do you where did the American legal system come from? Well, they borrowed it from the liberal parts of the British system, right? The American Constitution has been, and liberal theorists, right? But they didn't invent it out of whole cloth, right? A lot of it is from English common law. And like some of the French Revolution was informed by the American Revolution. It's like that political learning is not a new phenomenon. I think what's interesting is like the degree to which there are efforts to stand up international bodies that create formalized cooperation between these parties. And some of it was happening informally. Like one of the interesting things that I learned reporting the book is that the political consultant who helped Orbán decide that he needed to turn George Soros into his like enemy number one is an American political consultant who'd worked with the Republican Party, but had been introduced to Orbán by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Wasn't Prime Minister at the time, but
Beautiful. I hope
was,
these people go on holidays together.
they might actually. Orbán and Netanyahu, I think, might. But there was like a whole web there of just people who know each other, right? And those two, I think, are actually, of all of the people that I write about in the book, Orbán and Netanyahu are, I think, the closest in terms of their like career arcs being very similar, right? Both of them held power briefly in the 90s, and then in Orbán's case into the early 2000s. They both lost it. They both were more right wing than they even seemed. Though Netanyahu was pretty overt, but not quite as crazy as he would later become. And both of them said after they left power that the reason that they lost is because they didn't have, I mean, I think one of them said it literally, but it's the same basic thing. They didn't have their own control over the information ecosystem. And Netanyahu said specifically, I need my own media. Right. So they went on these exact same tracks in terms of, and then ended up acting similarly on return to power, though Orbán was far more aggressive than Netanyahu was, I think, facing facing no constraint, basically, since he had a majority in parliament that allowed him to pass constitutional revisions at will, whereas Netanyahu has always been in charge of a coalition government, and it's very hard to do democratic backsliding, or was until he had his recent far-right coalition that was willing to back him on this front. So yeah, there's a lot of learning that goes on here. Some efforts of this, I said something snooty about Steve Bannon earlier, but he tried to stand up one of these things and it totally failed. And this is part of like a lot of a consistent pattern with him. Like he tries to talk about these things and ends up not doing very much about them. Creating this format, this forum for international far-right cooperation in Europe is one of them. I think he tried to do it in a monastery outside Rome, and it just has not yielded any dividends that I've been able to see. Former monastery, excuse me. But yeah, that's increasingly becoming a real thing. There's a European Parliament faction that's far right. There are CPAC conferences around the world right now. They're devoted to sharing far right learning. The biggest of which, not in the US, of course, is in Budapest. And so there is an infrastructure increasingly. It's emerging. And there's also a lot of cross-national ideological communication, right? Forums, journals, magazines, tweets, that kind of thing. And the NatCon conferences internationally are another good example of this.
Yeah, I just want to ask one more question before we open it up. One major event you cite that seemed to awaken the reactionary spirit in Europe was the refugee crisis in 2015, and Angela Merkel of Germany chose to welcome this massive influx of migrants in. Do you think that was a political blunder, given how much support it fueled for neo-Nazis and the like?
It's a good question, because it's one where you have to balance like how bad the situation was and the humanitarian urgency of the crisis, which is like really easy to forget, right? These were millions of people who were stateless and homeless with the way it was responded to. I'm very loath to admit that letting in people who are desperate and giving them a home was the wrong thing to do, because it seems so clear cut morally that it was the right thing to do. So the question I want to ask first before I say, was that wrong, is, was there a way to admit as many people as the Europeans did at that point in time without causing the level of social and economic dislocation that led to a far-right backlash? I think the answer to that is yes, but it would have involved a lot more foresight in terms of planning for the influx of people than the European governments had done, and more resources than they were willing to spend. Right? It might have cost more in financial terms. But it ultimately, there were all of these people who needed somewhere to go and they had nowhere to go, right? There was no better alternative. They were breaking the countries they were in. The mass migration flows they can be a huge problem. And what are you supposed to do, right? They're going to live in Turkey indefinitely in a country that also can't deal with it. There were better ways to handle the influx of the system and to anticipate the political problems it might cause and the ballast it might give to the far right. But then what they did. But ultimately, I have a very hard time saying they shouldn't have let in the number of people that they did.
I mean, what I don't understand from that period is, I mean, if I look on a map, Syria is a long way from Germany. you know, even Turkey's a long way from Germany, but you know what's close is Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. I mean, why wasn't there more political? I mean, I don't know, you probably don't have the answers, but it seems to me that there should have been just a shitload of political pressure on those countries to accept refugees instead of just letting them all.
Can I say something about this? Because actually I know something that it might not be obvious for outsiders, but the like Hungary is on the border of the Schengen zone, right? Like beyond us is Ukraine, which is different time zone, not Schengen, not EU, not NATO still. And you know, in Hungary in 2015, the refugee crisis was extremely significant and it went on for a while. I think Hungary was already insanely right-wing, so it was not like, wow, that was the watershed moment. But it really did something, I think, to the self-respect to the country. Because I will give you an example. One of my closest friends' mother is the head of the neonatal unit in Petőfi Hospital, which is next to Keleti pályaudvar, which is the Eastern Railway Station where the campouts happened. And so, you know, she was she's a doctor and she's saving lives. So like day and night, she was outside helping the women who were either close to giving birth or who had just given birth during their journey. And it was, I mean, I get emotional just thinking about it. Like, this is actually like babies who were born a day ago on the road in the middle of nowhere. And so, you know, and a lot of my friends were volunteering, and this is just, you know, you go back to the basics of human life, which is that we need to give people water and blankets and food, and we need to ensure that babies survive and mothers survive. And they didn't want to stay.
Right.
And, you know, for us, it's like we are EU and Hungary is Europe, and we have like an okay system and like Nobel laureates. And the Syrian refugees who had like an iPhone, a newborn baby, and haven't eaten in 5 days were like, fuck no. And all they want, nobody stayed. And it was so interesting. It made me rethink what I think about Europe. And from their perspective, because they were coming from so far, they were like, if I had come this far at this cost, at this risk, leaving everything, then I'm going to go to Sweden. And it's, to me, that was absolutely fascinating. You see this in the US as well. Like immigrants come here from very far away, refugees, and they want to go to the good places. They are not like, oh, well, whatever, I will live in a not very good town in America. And to me, that was absolutely fascinating. But it changed how cool countries see themselves, you know? Because if you're so bad that even somebody on the verge of life and death doesn't want to stay there, you know, that's a piece of feedback.
Yeah.
To answer the original question, first of all, yes, that's all fascinating. That was really interesting. I hadn't thought about it from that point of view. Ironic, it's hard for me to imagine Hungarians say, "Oh no, we really wanted them to stay," because most of the ones that I talked to,
They
were like,
didn't,
no.
but they were like, "Oh, I'm crying because I didn't get invited to the party I didn't want to go to."
Yeah,
We didn't want them, but it's kind of still very offensive that they didn't even try staying here.
right. Right, I gotcha. There was a lot of political pressure on those countries, and there was eventually a deal to house a lot of the people there. And the largest refugee concentrations were all in border countries. So there were really huge amounts of people living in Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon, especially Turkey and Lebanon, just trying to get out of Syria. And it was creating unsustainable humanitarian conditions for those countries, which don't have the resources of wealthy European countries. They were living these people were living in filthy camps. They were not healthy. There was a severe lack of resources. And so people would risk going from a camp where they were at least getting some, you know, regular food from the Red Cross to Europe, because the systems locally were so overwhelmed that they didn't feel like they could stay there safely. And so they ended up taking these very risky, often very risky Mediterranean routes to get across from those camps. This is just Syria, right? There are also people coming from Afghanistan, and the route was different there. There were people coming from North Africa, leaving Libya, and the route was different there. But in general, I think the regional capabilities had been pushed beyond their breaking point. That's what led to the large influx into Europe.
Fair enough. I wonder if you could just, that was sort of a distraction. to what degree has technological change fed this? I mean, like Steve Bannon, way back, you know, he got sort of interested in the gamers phenomenon because he was part of a company that, you know, basically ripped off gamers and they all got mad and organized online against it. And he was like, oh, wow, this is energy we could use, you know. I mean, I think it's obvious to say, well, yeah, social media has contributed to this. But in particular, you were talking about, you know, the sort of transnational cooperation that goes on among these movements. But that I think extends to, and I first became really aware of it in 2016, seeing just all the fake news on Facebook and seeing, you know, people I knew in high school posting these obviously false stories, just comically false, and they really believed them. And you know, the right in America at least has tried to pretend, no, that's all bullshit. It was just a few ads, you know, on Facebook. It was nothing. But it seems to me that it was something and it's still happening. It's just more sophisticated.
Yeah, this is something I've changed my mind on a lot, but I also think maybe times have changed, right? Like I think in 2016, the evidence is pretty good that like it really wasn't, fake news wasn't the reason why Trump won. It was a problem. And we all forget the original term fake news was coined to describe like literal fake news articles that were created and news outlets that were created to trick people into thinking that this was like a legitimate coverage of Trump when it was actually just like made up stuff. Now, of course, Trump has stolen the term, but the thing that I think is like really bad, right, and potentially bad in a sustaining way that we didn't anticipate before is not just social media, like what is communicated on social media, but how things are communicated on social media. Right, the way in which it conditions your brain for conflict and for short bites of information rather than lengthy reflection. That even more than I think what is being said on those platforms has created a world where people are more open to a kind of gut punch politics that's more focused on antagonism and hating enemies and being against people and extremes really than things were before. And I think that's gotten worse, not better, right? I think short form video is awful. Like it's really bad. I make short form videos sometimes and I like try to make them good, but so I'm a bit of a hypocrite in this regard, but I think that like you have to meet people where they are to a degree, but where they are is bad, right? The fact that this is the way that people consume information now is one that doesn't even more so even than microblogging, right? Than Twitter, which is bad enough in this regard, right? Because it's, it's a personality, it's a person that's recognizable with a face, and they're talking for these very short blips of time that communicate limited information. It primes your brain to want conflict and anger. And it makes you receptive to somebody who's going to be like a really entertaining performer, even what they're saying is very dumb, right? Like I recently had the occasion to watch a bunch of videos of Candace Owens talking. Candace Owens is substantively an idiot. Like what she was saying was really very dumb. She's a very good performer on camera. And so the way in which she talks and the way in which the narrative that she presents emphasizes conflict between her and other people, with her as the good guys and her viewers as being part of the team against the bad guys. She's funny, she's telegenic, right? It's that kind of thing, right? That really does corrode discourse and make it so people like her, who are selling like a fundamentally warped and twisted view of the world, can do so more easily. And that's I think that is a problem that is becoming increasingly serious. And I don't know what to do about it. You can't you could maybe have banned TikTok, but the US government backed off of that one. And even if he did, there'd be a million competitors who would come up in its wake immediately. So I truly don't know what to do about that.
But Trump was doing this in like 2015 already, right? And TikTok was not prominent, which is to
That's what I'm
basically,
saying. It's a contributor to the problem. It's not at the root.
yeah, it's like
It's not at
basically
the-
what all couples therapists know, which is that it's the tone that matters, not what you say. So like if you can have the external forms and tones and vocabulary of reasonability, people will just be like, sure.
Mhm.
Neil,
Well,
you have your hand up.
Yeah, what do you got now?
Yeah, so I guess my question is somewhat related. I'm curious as to what you think about, obviously what you said about fake news. Like it does seem like on some level there's like this idea that spectacle is more important than facts now. It seems like, I even see leftists kind of admit that Trump is hilarious and that plays
he
a huge
is.
he is, right? And he's
That's
kind
why
of
there's
like
so many people who want to impersonate him and like very
right.
well, you know.
It's also kind of like beyond parody, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious as to what you think about how that plays a role. And I guess when we talk about, everyone loves to just absolutely criticize the Democrats in terms of messaging. Oh, you're too woke, you condescending. But I do think there's something to be said when I live in Dallas, right? I used to live in New York. Now I get the opportunity to talk to like, actual MAGA people, which is not the greatest. But when I do, I try to approach it with compassion and
Yeah.
really just walk away being like, the facts absolutely do not matter to them. It is an absolute cultish situation. And how do you build a cult? Like, how do you even try to attract that kind of thing? So sorry, I know there's a lot there, but I was curious as to your thoughts on that.
I mean, well, two things. One, second, reverse order, right? Like that's exactly the way that you should be approaching political disagreement, right? It's like you try, right? Even if the person that you're reaching is unpersuadable, at least you try, right? One thing that you owe to people who you share a polity with is you owe them at least the presumption that they're reasonable and that you can talk to them like somebody who is not an enemy, but rather someone you just disagree with and who is open to persuasion, dialogue, conversation, democratic deliberation. That's what it means to live in a democracy. Like, that's great. That's really good. Even if it doesn't work, like in the sense of persuading somebody, it might work in the sense of convincing someone, one of those people, and maybe even you, that people who disagree with you are not existential threats, right?
You can plant a seed too.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, this usually works best when it's someone you know and you care for, right? It's like persuasion. There's a lot of studies about this. Political persuasion works best when there's pre-existing trust between the people that are talking. So, like a random stranger on the street, you're not super likely to be able to convince them they're fundamentally wrong about the way they view the world. But if it's like your brother or your cousin or someone you went to school with, right? Even however tenuous, I mean, it's better, it's stronger the closer it gets, right? But that can work, right? Then you really they know that you're a decent person, or at least they think that they have some reason to think that you're a decent person. They believe that. That's why they're in your life. And so there's a foundation of trust that can allow them to take what you're saying very seriously, even if it contradicts their worldview. On the first point, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of thinking about whether we're entering a new age of political charisma, where what matters now more than it has in the past, or at least it did when I was growing up, is the qualities of the person who is making the argument, even on top of the argument itself. That parties, because there's a lot less trust in established institutions for reasons that we can talk about, some of which relate to the themes in the book, there's parties are less powerful than they used to be, and there's a lot of openness in the political system. And in situations like that, and I think probably exacerbated by the technological situation we find ourselves in, personal charisma is much more important in shaping the way that people do things. So I think that like the reason that I like really do like to say that Trump is funny is because he is, and it's important to recognize that, not just like as a you gotta hand it to him, no, not for that reason, but to like understand that that's really important to how he builds his political movement and what makes him successful as a politician. And if you don't grasp that, if you're I remember someone I know who's another journalist I used to argue with, and he's like very dogmatic, hardline. I can't believe you're saying Trump is funny. This man is a monster. How dare you? He's a threat to American democracy. I'm like, yeah, I agree with all of that, but he's still funny, Like you can be evil and funny at the same time. And if you can't recognize that, if you're so blinded by your own self-righteousness that you can't understand the appeal of the other person, then your political judgments can be badly compromised. You won't understand the phenomenon you're trying to combat and thus won't have good remedies for it. I think that's just sort of, it's like, it's not just like some people on the left say this because they kind of secretly want to beat Trump. That's not my take on it. Like there's a certain kind of leftist podcaster who's like that. But I think that's not the right takeaway. Obviously, the right takeaway is okay, this is actually a really potent political phenomenon, and charisma really matters in modern politics.
And if there's somebody who's like so widely popular, even if you don't like them or you don't get it, if you constantly talk about the fact that you don't understand, then the people who actually like this person will think that you think that they are stupid. And
Yeah.
most people actually, like the people who don't like Trump do think that the people who like Trump are stupid, misled, or some other form of like deplorable category of human behavior. And the people know that. And so there's this other layer of conflict between people.
What do you got, Jack?
Yeah, so I worked for quite a while on democracy and governance in Africa, and in a lot of countries there are nominally democratic, like we were talking about earlier, but functionally competitive, authoritarian. Some are backsliding, some are democratizing, but the prevailing mood among the average person, the common man, so to speak, is very cynical about politics as something that is transactional, and any talk of democracy is kind of an illusion. And so my question is that kind of general cynicism the destination of this reactionary spirit and a movement in history, or is it a separate phenomenon? How do the two things relate to one another?
Yeah. I think that it is sort of ballast or fuel for what's happening. I think a lot of what we like, I want to back up. There are, I think, pretty substantial differences between the politics of advanced wealthy democracies and developing countries that make it difficult to draw analogies or draw one-to-one comparisons in the nature and the type of distrust in government. Like when we talk about corruption in the United States, it's just like a whole different ballpark, even than right than the kind of countries that you worked in and you're talking about, right? Then, or even a country like Brazil or Mexico, right, where corruption's institutionalized to a degree. And like I pushed this a little bit in the book because I have a chapter about India, where India has many of the features of a developing democracy, but also many of the features of a more advanced democracy, which I think allowed it to work as sort of a better comparison point. It was a particularly useful comparison point for the US, given their similar levels of internal diversity, and large geographic and population sizes, though India is much larger population-wise. So bracketing that for a moment, I do think this low trust phenomenon, even if the causes are very different, like the routinized corruption of the developing countries and then the sort of total failure of government services in a lot of cases is a very different thing. That kind of politics shows us what happens when faith in institutions collapse, right? And faith in institutions is collapsing, right? And I think it is both a cause and a consequence of the rise of reactionary far-right politics. A consequence in the sense that there's a concerted campaign by basically all of these anti-democratic movements to discredit existing institutions. It's like they know that's how they win, right? Is like you're not going to win in a world where your obvious lies are being called out by trusted news sources that have universal appeal, right? And so in the American conservative movement kind of dug its own grave in this regard, right? They have spent their entire history, and I mean their entire history, like one of the founding texts of the movement is God and Man at Yale by William F. Buckley, right? Written in the 50s, before even the conservative movement as we know it in its modern iteration existed. Buckley helped create it with that book, right? Was about the institutional rot of American universities. And how they allegedly taught un-American propaganda. Now everyone's like, well, the university is too woke. Well, it's the same conversation that's being had for decades now. It is a position that the American right has taken at an institution that by its character, I think, attracts liberal personality types more than right-leaning ones. and is sort of in that way a kind of opposition stronghold in civil society. You know, same, you can say the same thing about the press, right? And the right's attack on the press. And it's not that these attacks have no founding, right? Obviously, American institutions or universities really are tilted too far to the left. Obviously, the press is increasingly a left-leaning, self-selected group, right? That's not, and that leads to coverage biases. That's not wrong. It's just the way in which the movement has taken those arguments has been to inculcate a total distrust among its co-partisans in those institutions. So when someone like Trump comes along, who was like not liked by the conservative establishment in 2015, right, and early 2016, like they really wanted to get rid of him. They couldn't. Why couldn't they? Well, partially because Trump spoke to the deepest, darkest desires of like a plurality of Republican voters, right? That's the sort of core thesis of my book, that there really was a brewing reaction against the sort of the central liberal democratic values that was happening amongst voters who had sorted into the Republican Party over the course of time. And that made it difficult to deal with it. But another part of it is that Trump called everything fake news. And you know what? The right had spent decades saying, if this is bad for our movement, it's fake news. It's a lie. It's not to be trusted. And so all he was doing was saying this thing that they've been telling you for a long time, yet it's just as true for established conservative outlets. And conservatives have been mad at their own leadership for a while. That was partially what the Tea Party was. And you could see it in the way that they had been electing insurgents for a while. So it wasn't gonna be able to, they weren't gonna be able to gatekeep Trump at this point because of this lack of trust in institutions. And now we're getting that towards government, right? And it's sort of a similar story. And this is true to varying degrees cross-nationally, right? It's not the same thing in different places, but there's certainly always the allegations of there being a sort of liberal deep state and liberal social civil society institutions that are biased against us, that are not to be trusted. That is a sort of universal feature of it. And ultimately, I don't know what politics look like in countries that are built to be high, like they're built on the foundations of high trust societies,
Right.
high trust assumptions of high trust. Right, that's partially, I was thinking about this earlier today because I saw someone trying to explain why what Trump was doing was illegal. And it's like, if it obviously is, if you look at the text of the law, but if you just like try to follow this as a non-lawyer, it's total gobbledygook, right? If you haven't paid attention to it. And so if Trump were to respond with similar legal sounding gobbledygook, you'd be like, I don't know, right? Who's to say what's right? And it depended, a trusting society depended on it being that people would be arguing about these things in good faith. Now they're not being argued about in good faith. Now nobody trusts what happens when the government says something or if they're lying. And again, I'm not saying the government's totally blameless in this regard. There have been significant mistakes in governance and public communication that have led to declining trust or helped contribute to it. But so this is not just like a simple story of the bad guys poison everybody against government. No, it's much more complicated than that. But now we're about to get a real test of what it looks like when you have social institutions that depended on sort of an assumptive level of trust in order to operate continually, had been built that way and operated that way for a long time, as opposed to like trying to build a culture of trust and having to like live in low trust institutions, or those that are designed or existed or grew out of a low trust, low capacity situation. Now you've got high trust, high capacity turning into low trust, but still nominally high capacity. I don't know what that looks like. I really don't. No one does. It's never happened before. We're about to find out, I guess.
Do you think we should maybe go back to not having primaries in that
Yeah, that's a conversation, but yes, probably. Primaries are bad. Other countries don't do them. This is like a weird American thing that is not actually democracy, right? Like political parties are the vehicles for democracy. They choose standards, and if you don't like them, then you can vote for another party. They're not themselves democratic institutions in the sense that like everybody who is in them needs to be held accountable to the voters, they're not elected officials. They're private citizens until they're actually elected. So it's super weird that we have this semi-formalized institution where oftentimes the primary election replaces the general election as the real election. That's just, it's bizarre in global context. And I don't think it fixes the problem. Like at this point, maybe it would have fixed the problem in 2015, but I don't think so. One, and two, the genie's out of the bottle at that point, right? So There are other electoral reforms that I think are valuable, but it's not, how would I put it? I don't think any electoral system is capable of solving the problem, right? Because you've seen variants of this kind of anti-democratic far-right politics emerge in countries with very different electoral systems. Like look at the four in the book, the US, Israel, Hungary, and India. They all have meaningfully different systems for electing people to government. Different ways of organizing the parties, different numbers of parties, but all of them have at one point or another elected a far-right authoritarian. And so that indicates to me that it's the systems can matter and they matter at the margins. I think it's like really important in Germany right now that they have a proportional system of the kind that they have. That's been really valuable for them, but they can't really contain it. If there's enough social support for one of these people, they're going to win eventually. So the issue you have to deal with is not the institutions, it's the social support.
What are the main factors that foment high demand for reactionary politics, would you say? We have the example with the refugee crisis, but what are the ways that generate this drive, this want for some kind of reactionary solution?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I was looking at the comments and trying to follow them.
Just what are the main, what creates high demand for reactionary politics?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is, and then I'll Trey, I see your question there, and I'll answer it after I answer this one. So it is at least I argue in the book, and I think there's a lot of empirical political science evidence supporting this. The basic contours of the situation are that reactionary politics arise in response to significant levels of social change, right? Or significant, at least a perception that things are changing. And so in the US, it was like ultimately the genesis of it was the civil rights movement, right? The reactionary spirit and civil rights movement in attendance, sort of women's liberation, the rise of the LGBT movement, just the sort of broad change in mores in a progressive direction. But what really crystallized it into a concrete political reaction was the election of Barack Obama in 2009. And there's all sorts of really, really good evidence about how having a Black guy in the White House fundamentally changed the way that a lot of people thought about politics. And that's what created and laid the groundwork in the American case for Trump to win. It's not that simple, right? Again, there's like decades of history that you need to understand why that mattered in that way. But it really was the moment in which the stage was set for the rise of anti-democratic populism in the United States. But arguably, the changes that I referenced a second ago there were global, right? This is why I think it's a global phenomenon. It's everywhere has been the case that you've seen movements towards including previously excluded minority groups, that you've seen demands that women be allowed out of the homes and into the workplace and participate as equal citizens, right? Everywhere you've seen, calls for religious minorities to have a degree of inclusion that they didn't have. That's just a feature of living in a liberal democratic society, is democracy creates the conditions in which previously excluded groups can push for their own rights to be vindicated. And that produces a backlash. And oftentimes it's related to the nature and the size of the change. And it's not always just like they're pushing or they create a social movement. Sometimes it's a legal change that happens. Sometimes it's a policy initiative by the government that raises tensions surrounding group identity to the fore or creates the threat of a major change. So that's what happened in Israel. It was really a lot of this was about the peace process in the 1990s. So much of the Israeli democratic backsliding, I wouldn't say all of it, but a lot of it emerged out of the hardline settler movement and emerged as a means of dealing with elements of Israeli society that they thought were going to force territorial compromise with Palestinians. Right, so democratic backsliding, far-right politics was a reaction to a sense that Jewish supremacy across that land was threatened by the current Israeli political system, and it very much was in the 90s when a lot of this started. And then it's more complicated in the other cases in the book, right? In Hungary, it's not like there was like a thing that happened. It's like Orbán himself was mad. And then he was sort of an opportunist and realized that there were reactionary elements of Hungarian society, and the refugee crisis was a particular crystallizing moment that he could turn into his like sort of public facing rhetoric and use to build a support base for himself, a durable one, even as many of his policies became unpopular and ineffective at what they were supposed to be doing. And in India, it's sort of like much more of a story of the nature of the Indian constitution. Right, there was a real fundamental divide in India over whether it should be a state for Hindus or a secular nationalist state, and that debate got interrupted when a Hindu nationalist assassin killed Gandhi, and that led to such revulsion in Hindu nationalism that kind of politics was deeply delegitimized for a long time. But over the course of several decades of Indian history, that changed. And the really fundamental divide among the Indian population, contestation over how to think about caste, how to think about the role of religion in society, what to do about the Muslim minority, all of these became the fault lines that could power a reactionary movement. And there were specific crystallizing events. A conflict over a temple was one, and a mosque that had been built on the site that was believed to by Hindu nationalists was a temple, was like one of the key crystallizing moments, but it's not the whole thing, right? These inciting events like Barack Obama's election, like the fight over the mosque / temple, they had to emerge out of a structural basis or a deeper structural change that gave people a sense that things were really changing. So I wanted to answer Trey's question, which is about how I learned about my grandfather's Holocaust survival story. People did ask him when he was alive. He wouldn't talk to me about it, but he died when I was 17. So he didn't, I think a lot of the time he just like didn't want to talk to a kid about this stuff. He also just like didn't really like talking about it in general, I think. But the reason that some of this stuff was known, I only found this out after he died, many years when I was researching the book actually, is that he had given a many-hour-long testimony to Steven Spielberg's Shoah Project, in which he detailed many of the stuff that I didn't know. I didn't even know to ask or to think about it. I'm not sure I knew that testimony existed until my mom told me. But a lot of the details.
My family also participated in it.
Oh, really?
Wow.
Yeah, no, it's an incredible project. And one thing that's frustrating about it in the archive is that you have to be a family member of the person involved to get access to it. And so like I really think this is a resource that in an era of rising anti-Semitism should be distributed to everybody. Like it should be the case that anyone should be able to go watch Holocaust survivors in their own names talking about what happened. So that isn't lost. Like it all should be digitized and fully public. I don't know why it doesn't make sense to me. But yeah, I found that, and that, so he said some of this stuff, right? He said it there. But he didn't like to talk about it with me, so I didn't know about it. And it took this German historian researching it to uncover a bunch of this stuff. And you know, their accounts were broadly consistent, which is good. But there were some details in my grandfather's testimony that the German guy hadn't found.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Did your grandfather also get the Spielberg letter? He sent everybody a letter and signed it. And for my aunt, that was like, I think she's in love with him. So that's like the most cherished thing
Cool.
in the household.
No, I mean, probably, but I've never seen
a letter from Steven.
I did not see it, no.
Back to the influencers and Candace Owens and having so much, you know, popular purchase on people's views on things. I saw recently that, I'm not sure this is actually verified, but people talking about how in China they're set to put some policy in place or already have maybe that, and I like your thoughts on it. Like influencers who talk about matters of importance or like crucial things. I don't know how they define that.
Oh,
but like,
no. I know we're talking about it. No,
Okay.
it's not actually that. It's
Okay.
it's a much more narrow thing that has been mistranslated.
Okay,
in
yeah.
language. It's which is it's a bad idea. Like you should not be making people get licenses to have state their opinion, like obviously.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it's a typical authoritarian heavy-handed solution to a problem, or would be if it was real, but in actuality it's about some like very narrow, I believe I mean, again, I'm citing a journalist who actually speaks Mandarin as opposed to me, I don't. But I believe that in the original translation, it's about dispensing professional advice over the internet. So you have
Okay.
to, like, you need to get a license if you want to be, doing e-consultations for taxes or medicine or whatever, which, like, that makes a lot of sense. You can't just have random people pretending to be doctors on the internet. And if that's
Right.
what it is, then, I mean, no one's going to argue with that. It just a lot of news coming out of China, you have to be cautious about it because a lot of the stuff is like it's not getting widely reported in the English press, and maybe one or two translations leaks out. Maybe the person who got it, their Mandarin isn't very good, and so you end up getting a weird botched translation version of it. So I always look when it comes to China stuff. I always look for like authoritative people, some people I know who are like careful China journalists or for a major news outlet to confirm it. And so in this case, I think it like sort of started as an internet rumor that they're like licensing influencers, and it was one of those things that was too good to check for a bunch of people.
And immediately struck me as like wildly implausible and like really just not sound.
Yeah, no, dumb idea, not real too.
Yeah. All right.
Any more questions? We have a HB who just dropped in at some point. Any questions before we wrap up? We're kind of over time.
Oh yeah, cool. That's
No,
right.
HB is a quiet listener.
All right.
Yeah.
Congratulations on the book. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Of course, I have like a lot of things to say about the Hungarian parts. The like India, I know very little about, but I feel kind of touched that you went so deeply into this because we often feel like, and I'm sure like this is the case for all the other geographies that you are discussing, so often, you have all these internal nuances and complications. And the people who have the context, they necessarily write for a local audience who will be interested in those nuances and contexts or complexities. And the only thing that makes it out of the country, even in the case of something as giant as India, is a kind of caricature or somebody's complete misunderstanding, better positive or negative, of the problem. And so I find that we had Julia Zonevent on a couple of months ago with her book Charm. She was my classmate at university, so like her success obviously is something that's very personally pleasing to me. And she also gives a little bit of a different twist from charm and charisma, a kind of take on the recipe of why illiberalism is so successful in the era of social media. And I'm just so grateful for you guys, because this is where kind of a massive phenomenon can really be understood. That it's not a one-off, it's not like you said, like it's not an accident that everybody who wanted to become liberal Democrats developed in their country. These are very mimetic, from female suffrage to, devolving into a fascist dictatorship. So you choose well what you copy, right?
I see you did just speak to Peter Thiel if you're talking about Mimesis and Gerard and
I was like, you have to stop liking Orbán. Like that was like, I was not nuanced, I did not feel like, I was like, we need to talk openly about this. He actually seemed a little bit jaded about Orbán. I think they had high hopes for him, and then the economy was like, lol.
yeah,
And these people like the economy, they like money. And so it's the same in China, right?
Yep.
Like be careful what you promise.
Yeah,
Promise that
absolutely.
there will be money and more babies, you better fucking have more money and more babies in a couple of years.
There's not more babies. They're not getting more babies. Yeah.
No, but Rose Douthat said like, oh, like one more baby was born in Hungary, so it's working. And I was like, I don't know.
That's not what was promised.
I do have one more question. What's that?
I was just going to say, actually, Tim Miller from the Bulwark, he wrote a book a few years ago called Why We Did It.
Yep. Great book. Really good.
Yeah, and I recommend that one because that's really about the professional class, like the influencers in DC, the lobbyists, the people who went from staunchly never Trump to, he has some good ideas, to full throated defense of them, and he has a whole taxonomy of like the various reasons. It's not one single reason. There's like 7 or 8 reasons that they do it.
I am looking up. I wrote a review of the book when it came out at the time. I really liked it.
Nice.
There we go. Here it is. Yeah, I really liked it. And I wrote it in it's sort of in conversation. I'll put in the chat with Nat Conway's book, The Right, which I thought
I
was
remember this article. Yeah.
which I thought was also very good, but sort of had some blind spots that Tim's book really accounted for. So that was good. All right, I
Good.
guess one more time. I should go. I
Thank
have
you
to
so
I have
much.
dinner for my family. It's so nice talking to all
Have
of
fun in Canada.
you. I'll do
Yeah.
my best.
Thanks for doing this, Zach.
Take care.
you.
Bye, guys. Ciao,
Yeah.
ciao.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, bye-bye.